Good morning, everyone. Have you ever noticed that we all have a certain pattern of living? And most of what we do isn't all that new. It's just stuff that we've seen or heard or read about other people doing. For example, many of us are just living in the pattern of our upbringing. It's those moments where we end up saying to our kids the same things that our parents said to us. Or how about the way we handle conflict or the traditions that we keep? On and on the list goes, but sometimes it's just what was modeled for us, and we end up living in that pattern. But as others of us, we kind of, as they say, fall into a pattern of living. Like we're going through life and we're trying to cope and we find a mechanism that may be constructive or destructive, but we just keep repeating it. Like when we go through a lull in our life and we end up just wanting to sit or sleep a little bit longer, we just want to maybe numb or we're just living life as very reactionary. And it's amazing how we can wake up 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line and we realize, wow, I've been doing this a while. But still, others of us, we look to other people and we try to mimic and follow their pattern of living. I remember when I was a kid, there was that old Nike ad that said, I want to be like Mike. And as a kid who loved basketball, I wanted to be like Mike. I mean, he was famous, he made lots of money, he was really good at basketball and could win championships, and he had great shoes. I mean, who doesn't want to be like Mike? But, long ago are those days. Now kids, teenagers, they want to be famous. They want to be famous YouTubers, right? Like my kids, they love this guy, Mr. Beast, who pretty much just makes videos and gives away money on them. I mean, who wouldn't want to be like that? But sometimes we get into a pattern of living because it's somebody that we're trying to live like. Well, I love what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, when he says these words, "Therefore I encourage you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." I mean, here Paul gives us two patterns of living. The pattern of this world, which is self-interests, or the pattern of faith, the pattern of Jesus, which is living sacrifice. It's humility. Or as Paul goes on to say in verse 3 there, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. Now this ought to sound familiar. It's pretty much what we heard Paul say in his letter to the Philippians that we've been looking at. Last week, he said something similar as Romans 12 in chapter 2. At the beginning, he says, not in view of God's mercy, but he kind of does the same thing when he says, so if there's any encouragement in Christ or comfort or love or participation in the Spirit, affection and sympathy, then do what? Then do this. He says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus. Here again, there's two patterns of living for self or living in the interests of others. And of course, we went on to talk about in verses 6 through 11 this Christ hymn, or what I call the Christ or the church fight song. And it's this V-shaped pattern of Jesus. It's the pattern that we're supposed to live into. Jesus was in the form of God, but he became in the form of a man, even unto death on a cross. And eventually he was exalted. And this V-shaped pattern is the way of discipleship. It's what it's all about in following, walking alongside Jesus, or as Paul likes to say, running the race or running alongside Jesus. One of the things, if we're going to be disciples who are learning to live in the pattern of Jesus, that we must have is one of these WWJD bracelets. Just kidding, but you may have remembered this. These were popular in the 90s. I still see them being worn from time to time. Actually, I saw my son start to wear one of those, and it's a great question. What would Jesus do? I mean, it's Christian cliche, but it's very thought-provoking. I mean, what would Jesus do right here in 2020? In my shoes, in my circumstances, with the resources I have and where I live, what would he do? How would he go about it? Well, this wasn't just something that was popular in the 90s. In fact, that WWJD question, what would Jesus do? It comes from a book 100 years earlier by Charles Sheldon called In His Steps. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it. Essentially, it follows the lives of some committed church members who begin to get serious about asking that question, what would Jesus do, in their jobs. For example, there's a guy who runs a newspaper, and he starts asking that question and wondering, how would Jesus run this newspaper? I mean, to which all of us are like, could all the news media outlets in 2020 start asking that question? Right? But it's a good book. But one of the difficulties in reading it, if you choose to, is that the things they were dealing with in 1890 are very different from 1990, very different from even 2020. And after all, one of the difficult things about answering that question is Jesus lived in the first century. Paul's writing in the first century to this church at Philippi. And there's very different circumstances, even though we know the teachings of Jesus. So sometimes how to apply this and live in the pattern, this V-shaped pattern in our own circumstances can be difficult. But that is why we have been given examples. I mean, Jesus, this is why he called disciples alongside him, so that he could pattern for them the way to live. And you know what? Before Jesus ascended, he said to his disciples in John 20:21, he said, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. He's sending them out to help others live in the very same pattern. And so in our reading today from Philippians 2, as we continue, we hear how eager Paul is to send two exemplary disciples to the church at Philippi. And the reason that he's excited to send them is because these are two examples that live in the pattern of Jesus. And he knows that in sending these examples, they're going to rub off on the church at Philippi. It's the same reason our parents got excited, when we were younger and we were hanging out with our friends. And, we probably had some of those friends that our parents questioned, like, really, should you be hanging out with them? But did you have that one friend or a couple of those friends where your parents knew they were a good influence? They're like, oh, you're hanging out with who? Oh, where are you going tonight? Here's money for dinner and stay out as late as you want. Right? Well, that's Paul is eager to send these examples because he knows they are going to help the church of Philippi live into that pattern of Jesus. The first example is Timothy. We read about Timothy in the book of Acts. He became the apprentice to Paul, served Paul. Paul loved sending Timothy out. Timothy mother was a Jew. His dad was a Greek. We can only kind of guess maybe about what that was like, being Jew and Gentile coming literally together in Timothy. Must have been a powerful thing. And I wonder what his story of faith was, if his dad actually had faith or he didn't, and how Timothy came to that. But Paul says here in Philippians chapter 2 that he has no one like Timothy, someone who is genuinely concerned about the welfare of others. That's why he can't wait to send him. Example number 2 is Epaphroditus. And as his name would suggest, probably named after the pagan god Aphrodite. And so again, we wonder what his story is, but like Timothy, we know at some point he too experienced what Paul wrote in Romans 12, that God's mercy came into his life. There was encouragement in the Spirit, as Philippians 2 says. There was sympathy and love and affection from Christ that entered into Epaphroditus, and he learned to start living in the pattern of Christ as well. And in fact, Epaphroditus is the reason that this letter to the Philippians is even happening. You see, the church at Philippi was going through their own hardship in this Roman colony, being likely ostracized as a group of Christians. But they hear about Paul imprisoned in Rome, maybe Ephesus, we're not exactly sure. And they want to care and send gifts to Paul to care for his needs while he's awaiting trial. And Epaphroditus is the one to deliver the care package. So the church at Philippi sends him, but while he's there, he gets deathly ill, literally to the point where he almost dies. And at some point, we realize in the letter that the church actually heard about it. They got a report that perhaps Epaphroditus would die. Can you imagine how discouraging that would be if you were the church at Philippi? You're already experiencing your own level of difficult circumstances, but then you're trying to care for somebody you're really concerned about. And you send one of your own, and then they're potentially going to die? What a low that would have felt. But the good news is Epaphroditus was revived and he didn't die. And so Paul was eager to send him back to the church at Philippi. And you know why? Here's what's so powerful of Epaphroditus as an example. He was distressed that his church was distressed over him. Have you ever met somebody like that? They just went through surgery or they're sitting in the hospital and they're really worried about you. They're thinking about your concerns and what you're going through. This is Epaphroditus. And at the end there of our reading today, he's like, would you just welcome him because he was willing to die, And this is something that we continue to see developed in Philippians, isn't it? I mean, Paul was willing to die to himself in order to keep on living for others. Jesus was willing to come in the form of a man and die so others could live. And here Epaphroditus just unexpectedly almost dies, but he's willing for the sake of the gospel. What two amazing examples of men who loved Christ and knew how to live in his pattern. But let's not forget the women in the church. There's a couple that we'll get to later in the letter, but you remember the reason the first convert in this church was Lydia. We read about her in Acts, talked about her a few weeks ago. When Paul, the reason he came to Philippi is because he got this vision of a man calling from Macedonia, come over here. But the first that he meets is Lydia and these women at the place of prayer. And they became converted and believed in Christ. And as we know, she was a dealer in purple cloth. She was instrumental in bringing the gospel from east to west. She was the first convert in Europe. And then she becomes what we think is the house leader, maybe of this church, and showed hospitality to the Christians there. I mean, what an amazing woman who is an example that's already likely a part of this church. And so Paul is so eager to send these examples. And the common denominator that each of them has is this. Timothy, genuinely concerned about the welfare of others. And Paul has no one like him in that respect. Epaphroditus, distressed over his church's distress. He wants to ease their anxiety and their worry. And so Paul's eager to send them so that they can experience what we've been saying, joy despite circumstances, joyful anyway. So I just want to make this point for us isn't it the true for us? I mean, just think for a moment, who has been an amazing influence in your life? Who do you love hanging out with the most? Who do you get the most joy from? Well, I bet the common denominator with your answer is that it's someone who's genuinely concerned about your welfare. They're interested in you. They're curious about you. They pray for you. They look after you. So in a roundabout way, learning to live in the pattern of Jesus actually just means looking up to those who look after others. And in fact, it's maybe not looking up, it's looking down, because those who look after others are always serving. They're the ones that are at the bottom, like Jesus, the bottom of the V, looking up at others. You all, if we find ourselves lacking joy, perhaps we should stop trying to just muster it up by our own self-will. And we should start just practicing the pattern of Jesus. We should just pick some people around us and start looking after their welfare, being interested in them, asking them questions, praying for them, and reaching out. No doubt that in being a cause for their joy, that joy will ricochet back into our lives. You see, that's exactly what happened in this letter. The church at Philippi had every reason not to be joyful in their circumstances, but they cared for Paul, and they sent Epaphroditus to care for his needs. And now what's Paul doing? He's sending joy back to them. And so what happens in this way as we begin to look to not only our own interests, but the interests of others, it creates this kind of ricocheting effect, or this circular effect of joy, and then it just begins to lift the church. You all, if we want to be disciples of Jesus and live into that V-shaped pattern, we should look up to those who look after others, and we should seek to imitate them.